Have you ever, stopped to think about what's really underneath all your thoughts? Like your reasoning, even how you decide what's true?
Hmm.
What if the whole way you make sense of things depends on something you maybe don't even buy into?
That's a big question to start with.
It is. Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, and today we're really getting into something fascinating.
Mm.
This major historical debate. It wasn't just like a friendly chat. It was a serious clash asking, well, the biggest question, right?
Mm.
Does God exist?
Mm.
We're calling this specific deep dive reformed thinking.
That's right. Our focus is that, well, pretty well-known debate between Dr. Greg Bahnsen and Dr. Gordon Stein. Bahnsen arguing for Christian theism from a presuppositional angle.
Which we'll definitely unpack.
Oh, yeah. And then Dr. Stein presenting the atheist view more from an evidential standpoint. This all went down at the University of California, Irvine. David Agopian from their speech and debate team moderated.
Right. And our goal here really is to pull out the main ideas, the different ways these two thinkers argued.
Yeah.
So you can get a better handle on how worldviews shape everything, even how we think about logic itself.
Yeah, and what it really takes to argue for or, against God's existence.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit more. Who are these guys?
All right, so Dr. Greg Bahnsen, he was a Christian philosopher, a theologian, had multiple master's degrees from Westminster Theological Seminary, a PhD in philosophy from USC.
Solid credentials.
Definitely. Wrote several scholarly books, apologetics, ethics, theology. He was also a pastor when this debate happened. And the key thing for our discussion is his method, presuppositional.
Okay, and facing him, Dr. Gordon Stein, an American scholar, a pretty prominent figure in atheism back then, PhD from Ohio State.
Right.
He wrote quite a bit too, 5 books. One title was pretty bold, How to Argue with a Theist and Win.
Tells you where he's coming from.
Yeah, no ambiguity there. He was president of groups like the American Rationalist Federation, the Free Thought Association. So a significant voice for atheism and secular humanism at the time.
And the venue, UC Irvine, their speech and debate team, which was nationally ranked, hosted it. The president, David Agopian, he was the moderator.
And he laid down some pretty strict rules, didn't he?
He did. Very structured format, a hybrid debate format, he called it. No applause, no camera flashes, no audience participation at all.
Yeah, I remember reading he even mentioned having CSO officers and like former football players there to keep order.
Right, really emphasizing the academic, serious nature of it. Just focus on the argument.
And the core question, plain and simple, does God exist?
So how did they kick things off? Their opening stances are really telling.
Bahnsen was very clear.
Yeah.
He wasn't just defending some vague idea of God, but specifically Christian theism as a whole system.
Right, not just bits and pieces.
Exactly. And he kind of headed off some common objections right away. Things like, hypocritical Christians or historical atrocities done in the name of religion, or even by atheists, like during the French Revolution's reign of terror or the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, he acknowledged those things happen.
But his point was, those actions don't automatically invalidate the philosophical system itself.
Yeah.
He wanted to talk about the coherence and truth of the Christian worldview as a framework for thought.
Okay, so Bahnsen focused on the system. What about Stein?
Stein came out saying his goal was to look at the proofs theists offer and show why they don't work. He was careful about defining atheism, too.
How so?
He said an atheist isn't someone who proves God doesn't exist or even denies God exists necessarily. It's simpler. An atheist is someone who has looked at the theist's arguments and finds them, well, inadequate, unproven.
So the burden of proof is key for him.
Absolutely. He used analogies, a man claiming he can fly, a dog talking. He said, look, the person making the extraordinary claim has to provide the proof. If they don't, you just don't believe it. You're without belief. It's not that you have proof they can't fly.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's get into Bahnsen's approach, this presuppositional method. It's different from what many people might expect.
It really is. His basic idea is that everyone starts with certain foundational beliefs. Core convictions about reality, knowledge, truth, whether you realize it or not.
This is a presupposition.
Exactly. And these presuppositions act like lenses. They shape how you interpret all the evidence that comes your way. It's not that evidence doesn't matter, but your worldview determined what you even count as evidence and what it means when you see it.
So no truly neutral observer, in his view.
Pretty much. You don't just look at facts blankly. Your underlying framework tells you how to connect the dots.
Okay, so he wasn't just offering proofs for God in the usual way.
Not primarily, no. He was questioning the very ground rules of how we evaluate evidence. He took issue with Stein, saying the God question is just another factual question, like checking for crackers in a pantry.
The crackers in the pantry fallacy.
That's what he called it. He argued, look, different kinds of things need different kinds of proof. Barometric pressure, you measure it. Quasars, you observe them telescopically. Natural laws, numbers, love, beauty, these aren't physical objects in a pantry.
Right, you need different methods.
Exactly. So the type of evidence you look for depends on what you're talking about. You don't measure love with a yardstick or put gravity under a microscope. Bahnsen's point was, God, being transcendent, spiritual, isn't the kind of thing you'd find like crackers. The method has to fit the subject.
And then he went further, challenging Stein's own foundation.
He did. He pointed out what he called the pretended neutrality fallacy. Stein had said, basically, that logical reason is the only valid way to check factual claims.
Okay, sounds reasonable on the surface.
But Bahnsen asked, how do you prove that statement itself? If you use logic to prove that logic is the only way, well, that's circular reasoning, right? Which Stein himself said was bad.
Okay. I see the problem.
And if Stein uses something other than logic to prove it, then his own rule that logic is the only way is broken.
So Bahnsen is saying Stein's reliance on logic as the ultimate authority is itself an unproven starting point, a presupposition.
Precisely. It's a core belief Stein holds, not something he empirically demonstrated before using logic.
And Bahnsen connected this to Stein's view of science, too.
Yes. He argued Stein's prededication to naturalism. The idea that supernatural explanations are not allowed in science was another unproven assumption. It just begs the question, Bahnsen said.
Meaning it assumes what it's trying to establish.
Kind of. It rules out God from the start before even looking at the evidence from nature or history. It sets the rules of the game in a way that automatically excludes a theistic interpretation. Bahnsen suggested this is just as much a worldview commitment as a theist interpreting things through their lens.
So his whole point was, everyone has these lenses, these starting points. You can't escape them.
That was the setup, to show that neutrality is an illusion and everyone argues from a worldview.
Okay, so after critiquing Stein's foundation, what was Bahnsen's positive case? This transcendental argument, TAG.
Right, this was the centerpiece, TAG, the Transcendental Argument for God's existence. His goal, he said, was to prove the existence of God from the impossibility of the contrary.
Whoa, that sounds ambitious. What does that mean, impossibility of the contrary?
It means he argued that if you don't presuppose God, specifically the Christian God, you actually lose the ability to prove anything at all. His claim was incredibly bold. Without him, God, it is impossible to prove anything.
So not just that God exists, but that God is necessary for proof itself.
That's the core of it. He argued the atheist worldview ultimately self-destructs because it cannot consistently provide the preconditions of intelligible experience, science, logic, or morality.
Okay, how did he try to show that? Let's take logic, for example.
Good example. He zeroed in on the laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. Something can't be both true and false in the same way at the same time. He asked, what are these laws?
Okay, what are they?
Well, Bahnsen pointed out they seem to have certain properties. They're universal. They apply everywhere, always. They're invariant. They don't change. And crucially, they're immaterial. They aren't physical things. You can't weigh or measure the law of non-contradiction.
Right. They're abstract concepts.
Exactly. He called this their transcendental necessity. Now, the challenge he posed to atheism was, how does a purely materialistic worldview where everything is just matter and energy account for these universal, unchanging, immaterial laws?
If they're just human inventions.
Right. If they're just conventions like rules of grammar, or maybe just how our brains happen to be wired through evolution, Bahnsen argued they lose their absolute authority. Why couldn't another society just invent different laws of logic? How can we even have a rational debate or do science if logic wasn't universally binding?
So he's saying atheism can't provide a solid ground for logic.
That was his contention. He said the atheist worldview cannot allow for laws of logic in this robust sense. He even famously told Stein that when Stein used logic to argue against God, he was actually borrowing from the Christian worldview.
Why borrowing?
Because, Bahnsen argued, these abstract, universal, unchanging laws make perfect sense if there's a God whose very nature is rational and consistent, who created a universe that reflects that order, a God who stands against contradiction.
Okay, I see the connection he's drawing. Did he apply this to anything else?
Yes, definitely to the uniformity of nature. This is the assumption that the basic laws of physics and chemistry will work the same way tomorrow as they do today. It's fundamental for science, right?
Absolutely. You couldn't do experiments otherwise.
Bahnsen asked. What basis does atheism have for assuming this uniformity? In a universe that's ultimately just random matter in motion, why should nature be orderly and predictable? He argued the Christian worldview, with a faithful God upholding creation, provides a rational basis for expecting this uniformity.
So, for Bahnsen, God isn't just one more fact in the universe, but the necessary foundation for understanding the universe rationally.
That's a great way to put it, the preconditions of intelligibility.
Okay. Let's switch gears now to Dr. Stein's arguments. How did he respond, and what was his overall strategy?
Stein's strategy was more, let's say, traditional in apologetic debates. He focused on defining terms clearly and then systematically refuting arguments for God's existence.
We mentioned his definition of atheism finding the proofs inadequate and the burden of proof point.
Right. He also offered a specific definition of God for the debate, a supreme personal being, distinct from the world and creator of the world. He noted this was similar to one used in the famous Copleston-Russell debate.
So establishing common ground on what they were debating about.
Exactly. And then he made that strong statement about science. Supernatural explanations are not allowed in science.
Why did he see that as so crucial?
He felt allowing them would be begging the question, using the thing you're trying to prove, the supernatural, as part of the explanation. He also thought it would just stop scientific inquiry. If any weird result could just be chalked up to God did it, why bother looking for natural causes?
A kind of methodological naturalism for science?
He saw science as operating, by definition almost, on an atheistic premise, seeking only natural explanations.
Okay, so from that foundation, he went on the offensive against theistic arguments.
He did. He went through a list. He mentioned 11 major ones. Let's touch on a few key ones.
Like the cosmological argument, the first cause idea.
Yeah. Stein's critique was basically, if everything needs a cause, then God must need a cause too. That leads to an infinite regress. Or, he said, if you claim God doesn't need a cause, well then, maybe the universe doesn't need a cause either, so the argument fails.
But as you mentioned earlier, that might misunderstand the classic argument.
It often does. The argument usually isn't everything needs a cause, but everything that begins to exist needs a cause, or every contingent thing needs a cause. The conclusion is a necessary, uncaused being. Stein's version is a bit of a simplification, or maybe even a straw man, depending on how charitable you want to be.
Okay. What about the design argument? Things look designed, so there must be a designer.
Similar critique from Stein. If the universe needs a designer because it's complex, then God, who must be even more complex and wonderfully designed, would need an even greater designer. Again, infinite regress.
Right. The who designed the designer objection.
Then there was the argument from the Bible. Stein dismissed that pretty quickly as circular reasoning. Using the Bible to prove God assumes the Bible is inspired by God, which assumes God exists.
Okay, that's a common objection. Miracles.
He said arguing for miracles also begs the question by assuming the supernatural is possible in the first place. He quoted Thomas Paine basically, it's always more likely someone is mistaken or lying than that the laws of nature were violated.
A skeptical stance on testimony versus natural law.
Ontological argument, proving God from the concept of perfection. Stein said, look, just because you can define something as perfect doesn't mean it exists. Existence has to come first, or be demonstrated, not just defined.
The perfect island objection, basically.
Right. And the moral argument, objective morals point to God. Stein offered naturalistic alternatives. Morality as a survival tool, learned behavior passed down culturally.
And he pointed to moral diversity.
Yeah, he argued if morality came directly from God, shouldn't everyone have the same moral code? The fact that we don't suggests it's more likely a human or cultural construct.
Okay. He also briefly hit others. Life, wish, faith, experience, Pascal's wager.
Yes, quickly. Evolution explains life. Wishing doesn't make things real. Faith is belief without evidence. Religious feelings aren't facts. And Pascal's wager is a bad bet based on fear and picking the right God. He was clearly prepared to address that whole range of standard theistic arguments.
So Stein's approach was really about dismantling the evidence presented by theists?
Primarily, yes. Knocking down the pillars of theistic proof as he saw them.
But how did he handle Bahnsen's challenge about the foundations, particularly logic and scientific laws, from an atheist perspective?
This is where the debate got really focused, especially in the cross-examination. Stein did offer explanations. For laws of logic, he said they are universal, but also agreed upon by human beings. He called them conventions, sociological laws, or laws of thought.
Conventions, like traffic laws.
Sort of. But he also explicitly denied that a law could be material. He seemed to struggle a bit here. Later, he described them as consensuses based on observations. He even brought up Zen koans as maybe suggesting different kinds of logic exist.
So a bit inconsistent. Are they universal or conventions or based on observation?
It seemed hard for him to pin down a consistent naturalistic account that captured their apparently necessary and universal character. For scientific laws, he defined them more statistically, an observation that's made over and over again.
Not absolute decrees, but descriptions of regularities.
Right. And where does that regularity come from? He attributed it to the inherent property of matter. Like electrons just do behave this way, magnets just do attract or repel. This inherent behavior, he argued, creates a logical, rational universe without a God.
So order arises from the properties of matter itself.
That was his claim. He concluded that lacking a God wasn't detrimental to logic and to having laws in an atheist universe. He felt he had offered a sufficient naturalistic explanation.
Okay, so that sets up the direct clash, particularly when Bahnsen got to cross-examine Stein.
Exactly. Bahnsen really pressed him. He kept asking about Stein's definition of atheism, his sources, and pointedly asked if Stein felt he had actually addressed the Transcendental Argument. Bahnsen clearly wanted to keep the focus on that foundational challenge.
And the exchange about the laws of logic being immaterial was key.
Absolutely pivotal. Bahnsen asks, are laws of logic universal? Stein says yes. Are they material? Stein says no, a law can't be material.
Okay.
Then Bahnsen asks, can you give me an example of something else that's universal and immaterial? Besides God.
Putting him on the spot.
Big time. There's a pause in the recording, apparently. Then Stein offers, laws of logic.
Using the thing they're debating about logic itself as the example.
Exactly. Bahnsen jumps on this. How can Stein, arguing for a purely materialistic universe, acknowledge these powerful, universal, immaterial entities like laws of logic without contradicting his own worldview? It seemed like a major inconsistency Bahnsen was highlighting.
Did Bahnsen push on other immaterial things?
Yeah, he asked about ghosts, the soul. Stein actually conceded that humans have an immaterial aspect.
Really? That seems like a big concession for his position.
It does. Stein tried to kind of brush past it, but Bahnsen brought it back, pointing out the seeming circularity of Stein possibly referencing the Bible, implicitly or explicitly, for ideas about man's immaterial aspect, while simultaneously denying the Bible's authority and God's existence in the main debate.
So Bahnsen was constantly trying to show internal contradictions in Stein's framework.
That was the core of his strategy during the interaction phases, exposing alleged inconsistencies.
How did commentators view their styles afterwards?
A common take is that Stein seemed, well, maybe blindsided is too strong, but certainly unprepared for Bahnsen's specific presuppositional attack. Stein was ready for evidential arguments, but this foundational critique of the basis for knowledge and logic itself seemed to catch him off guard.
So he stuck to his prepared points.
Often, yes. He'd circle back to his refutations of the 11 proofs, rather than directly grappling with Bahnsen's transcendental argument in depth. It felt like he was answering the arguments he expected, not always the ones Bahnsen was making.
And Bahnsen?
He was generally praised for being very disciplined, very clear, and really controlling the flow of the debate by constantly bringing it back to his core argument about presuppositions and the impossibility of the contrary. He didn't lay everything out at once, which let him keep pressing Stein on foundations.
Okay, let's step back and compare the two approaches more broadly. What are the takeaways about presuppositional versus evidential apologetics from this debate?
Well, Bahnsen's presuppositional approach, its strength, is that it goes straight for the foundations, the underlying worldview. It challenges those prededications everyone has.
It tries to unmask that pretended neutrality.
Exactly. It highlights that everyone starts with unproven assumptions. And its main positive argument, tag, focuses on the impossibility of the contrary, arguing that only the Christian worldview can consistently account for things we take for granted, like logic, science, morality.
So it aims for the root, not just the branches.
Right. Instead of just swatting at individual arguments, which Bahnsen thought was like putting out small fires while the main fuel source remains, it tries to show the whole opposing structure is unsound. This gives the presuppositionalist a way to control the debate, forcing the opponent onto the defensive about their own worldview's consistency.
And it seemed effective here because Stein wasn't ready for it.
It's certainly seen that way. For Bahnsen, this wasn't just a debate tactic either. He saw it as showing the foolishness of unbelief, hoping God would use it.
Okay, what about the evidential approach Stein used? What are its strengths, and where did it seem weak in this particular encounter?
The strengths of evidentialism generally are its focus on reason, logic, empirical evidence, treating God's existence like a scientific hypothesis or a historical question. Stein did this well. He clearly put the burden of proof on the theist.
And he was ready for those standard proofs.
Very much so. His systematic rebuttal of those 11 arguments showed preparation in that area.
But the weaknesses, as highlighted by Bahnsen.
Well, the crackers in the pantry problem may be oversimplifying what kind of thing God is. The potential circularity in its own foundation, like assuming logic's authority without grounding it. The prededication to naturalism that arguably screened out possibilities unfairly from the start.
And the struggle to account for things like logic.
Yes, that seemed to be a major sticking point. Trying to explain universal immaterial laws as just conventions or observations or properties of matter didn't seem fully convincing or consistent, especially under Bahnsen's cross-examination. He also seemed to mischaracterize some arguments, like the cosmological one. And fundamentally, he didn't seem to engage deeply with Bahnsen's core transcendental challenge.
So, wrapping this up, what should you, our listener, take away from this whole exchange?
I think the biggest thing is seeing that debates about God aren't just about isolated facts. They're really about entire worldviews colliding. Everyone, consciously or not, has these foundational beliefs that color how they see everything.
There's no truly neutral viewpoint when you get down to these ultimate questions.
Right. And that leads to the question, which worldview actually makes the most sense of reality as we experience it? Which one provides a more coherent, consistent explanation for things like logic, the orderliness of nature that allows science, even our sense of morality?
Does a purely naturalistic universe account for those things as well as, or better than, a theistic one?
Yeah.
That's the challenge posed.
And remember Bahnsen's perspective.
Wow.
This wasn't just intellectual sport. It was about demonstrating the rationale of belief and the potential pitfalls of unbelief, hoping it would have a real effect on people's thinking and ultimately their relationship with God.
So maybe a final question for you to chew on. What does it mean if the very tools you use to think and reason your logic, your scientific method, might themselves depend on a particular worldview to be fully justified?
If the foundation requires something you don't currently accept, what does that imply? It's definitely something worth pondering as you continue to think through your own understanding of the world.
We really hope this deep dive into the Bahnsen-Stein debate has given you some clarity, maybe sparked some new thoughts about God, how we argue about belief, and those deep down assumptions that guide us all.
Yeah, we definitely encourage you to keep thinking about these things. Look at your own presuppositions. How do they shape how you see reality? It's a worthwhile exercise.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We look forward to our next exploration together.